Somewhere beneath the Egyptian desert sits a piece of stone the size of your fist, and it has quietly broken the official story of ancient Egypt for over a century. It is not a treasure. It is not gold or a painted coffin or a jeweled amulet. It is a plug of solid granite, pulled from the inside of a drilled hole thousands of years ago and thrown away as garbage. Nobody was ever supposed to look at it twice. But etched around its surface are spiral grooves, cut clean and even, winding down the stone like the thread of a screw. And once you understand what it actually takes to cut a groove like that into granite, you start to understand why this small, discarded piece of rock has become one of the most argued over objects in all of archaeology. And granite is not an easy stone. It is not sandstone, and it is not limestone, both of which the Egyptians shaped by the millions of tons with relative ease. Granite is an igneous rock, born from magma that cooled slowly deep underground, and that slow cooling locked interlocking crystals of quartz, feldspar, and mica into an extremely tough, dense structure. On the Mohs hardness scale, which measures how easily one material can scratch another, granite sits at roughly 6 to 7. Copper, the primary metal available to Old Kingdom Egyptians, sits at around 3. That is not a small gap. It is the difference between a material that can dent a fingernail and one that can shatter it. This is the puzzle at the center of the granite question. The Egyptians left behind granite obelisks, granite sarcophagi, granite temple casing stones, and granite vessels so thin in places that light passes through the walls. Some of this work dates back over 4,000 years, to a civilization that, as far as the archaeological record shows, had no iron, no steel, and no motorized tools. And yet a granite was cut, hollowed, drilled, and in many cases polished to a mirror finish. The question of exactly how they did it has never fully gone away, and in recent years, it has become the centerpiece of a much larger and more controversial argument, one pushed hardest by the British writer Graham Hancock. Hancock's claim is not simply that ancient Egyptian stonework is impressive. Plenty of mainstream Egyptologists would agree with that much. His claim is more specific and far more radical. He argues that the precision seen in Egypt's oldest granite work is too advanced to have been invented by the early dynastic Egyptians themselves, and that it must instead be the leftover skill of a much older civilization, one that existed before the last ice age ended and was wiped out in a global catastrophe roughly 12,000 years ago. In his telling, the Egyptians of the Pyramid Age were not the inventors of this technology. They were its last fading inheritors, copying methods they only partly understood, using tools that were themselves just crude echoes of something better that had already been lost. To evaluate a claim like that fairly, you have to start where Hancock himself starts, with the physical evidence in the stone. And the physical evidence begins with a British archaeologist who arrived in Egypt in 1880, 3 years before the drill core find that would eventually make his name relevant to this entire debate. William Matthew Flinders. Petrie was not like most of the excavators. Working in Egypt at the time, he was not hunting for royal tombs or golden treasure. He was a surveyor by training, obsessive about exact measurement, and he approached the pyramids and temples the way an engineer inspects a machine, not the way a treasure hunter inspects a ruin. He carried calipers, measuring rods, and a level of patience that most of his contemporaries found strange, even tedious. That obsession with precision is exactly why he noticed something almost everyone else had walked past without a second glance. Among the debris scattered around ancient quarries and temple sites, Petrie found broken cores of granite and diorite, the waste left behind when a hollow drill bores into solid stone, leaving a cylindrical plug in the middle the way an apple core leaves a plug of apple. These cores are functionally garbage. Nobody in ancient Egypt kept them on purpose, but their surfaces told a story. Cut into them were spiral grooves, and when Petrie studied the spacing and depth of those grooves, he calculated that the drill had advanced through the stone at a rate that struck him as extraordinarily fast for a hand-powered tool cutting into material this hard. He published his measurements and his conclusions in 1883 in a book called The Pyramids and Temples of Gizeh, and estimated that the downward force needed to achieve those cutting rates would have been substantial, in his own words, describing pressures that seemed almost unbelievable for hand tools of the era. This is the finding Hancock, along with engineers like Christopher Dunn, has leaned on for decades. Petrie himself never claimed the Egyptians had lost technology from a vanished civilization. He assumed some form of harder cutting point, possibly jeweled or corundum-tipped, had been fixed into the copper tubes, since copper alone could not explain what he was seeing. That idea, a jewel-tipped drill bit set into a soft copper shaft, is actually not far from what modern experimental archaeology has since demonstrated was plausible, though the full picture turned out to be more mundane than either lost super technology or lost jewel-tipped drills. The real answer, as later researchers discovered, involves something Petrie underweighted at the time: loose abrasive sand. In the late 20th century, an experimental archaeologist named Dennis Stocks decided to actually test the ancient methods rather than simply speculate about them. Stocks had a background in mechanical engineering and design education, and he spent decades in Egypt building working replicas of ancient tools, then using them exactly as tomb paintings and archaeological evidence suggested the Egyptians had. He built copper tube drills, copper saws, wooden bow drills, and stone mauls, and he tested them directly on granite blocks in the Aswan quarries, the same source region the ancient Egyptians used for their finest granite work. What Stocks found changes the picture considerably. The copper itself was never the cutting agent. It was the carrier. When a copper tube or copper saw blade is pressed against granite with a slurry of wet quartz sand between the metal and the stone, it is the hard quartz grains, not the soft copper, that do the actual cutting. The copper simply holds and drags the abrasive across the surface, embedding grains into its own edge as it works, essentially turning itself into a crude but functional grinding tool. This solves the hardness paradox Hancock and others point to. Nobody needs a tool harder than granite if the actual cutting is being done by loose quartz sand, which sits at roughly the same hardness as the quartz crystals inside the granite itself. Stocks demonstrated that copper tube drills, worked with sand slurry and turned by a weighted bow drill, could bore into granite. It was slow. It required real effort, sustained rotation, and constant replenishment of the sand as it wore down. But it worked, and it produced cores with spiral grooving strikingly similar to the ones Petrie had documented, because the grooves were simply the natural signature of an abrasive slurry being dragged around in a rotating cut, not evidence of a mechanized tool spinning at high, steady speed. This is the point where the story genuinely splits, and where honesty requires laying out both sides rather than picking the more dramatic one. Hancock and several engineers, most prominently Christopher Dunn, argue that Stocks' experiments, while proving copper and sand can cut granite in principle, do not fully account for the speed, consistency, and scale Petrie originally measured. Dunn, who spent decades as a precision machinist working on jet engine components before turning his attention to Egypt, has argued for years that the flatness and parallelism he personally measured inside granite boxes at Saqqara and elsewhere exceed what hand methods, however patient, could reasonably achieve. He has proposed, at various points, that some form of vibrational or ultrasonic technique may have been involved, a hypothesis that remains entirely speculative and has not been demonstrated experimentally in any peer-reviewed setting. Mainstream Egyptologists and materials scientists respond that scale and speed are not the mystery Dunn and Hancock present them as. Ancient Egypt was not working under modern deadlines. A single granite sarcophagus or obelisk could occupy a team of skilled workers for months or years, and the Old Kingdom state had the organizational capacity, the same capacity that moved 3 million limestone blocks to build the Great Pyramid, to dedicate large, long-term labor forces to a single object. Given enough time, enough hands, enough sand, and enough patience, the abrasive method scales. Stocks himself, along with later researchers who built on his work, has directly addressed the impossibly fast reading of Petrie's numbers, arguing that Petrie's estimate of the force involved assumed continuous, uninterrupted cutting at a steady rate that ancient workers, rotating in shifts and periodically replenishing sand, would not have needed to sustain in the way Petrie's math implied. The 40,000 stone vessels found beneath the step pyramid of Djoser, many predating the pyramid age itself, are frequently cited by Hancock as further proof of lost technology, since some have walls only a few millimeters thick and symmetry that seems difficult to achieve by hand. These vessels are real, and their craftsmanship is genuinely extraordinary. Dennis Stocks directly examined this vessel tradition as well, documenting that different stones in the cache were worked with different tools matched to their hardness. Softer stones like calcite worked with flint and copper punches, and harder stones like granite, quartz crystal, schist, and basalt requiring the same sand-abrasive drilling and grinding techniques used on obelisks and sarcophagi. Modern experimental potters and stoneworkers who have attempted to replicate these vessels by hand report the work as grueling and imperfect, which is not itself evidence of lost technology so much as evidence that ancient Egyptian craftsmen were operating at the very edge of human skill, refined over generations of specialized inherited practice within closed workshop traditions, the kind of deep vocational expertise that is genuinely difficult to reproduce today, precisely because that unbroken chain of practice no longer exists. Which brings us to the part of Hancock's argument that is less about tool marks and more about timeline, and it is arguably the more interesting half of his case, because it does not rest on disputed measurements of drill cores. It rests on a pattern. The claim is this: skill is supposed to accumulate. A civilization's stonework should start rough and improve with each generation as techniques are refined and passed down. In Egypt, Hancock argues, the opposite happens. The Great Pyramid of Giza, along with its companion pyramids and the associated Valley Temple built largely from massive granite and limestone blocks, stands among the earliest of Egypt's grand stone monuments, roughly 2560 BCE, and by any measure remains the most precisely constructed pyramid Egypt ever produced. Later pyramids, built by pharaohs, with, in theory, centuries of additional accumulated experience behind them, are frequently smaller, less precisely aligned, and structurally weaker. Some, like several pyramids from the 13th dynasty, have partially collapsed. Hancock's question is simple. If the Egyptians were climbing a learning curve, why does their masterpiece sit at the bottom of the climb instead of the top? This observation is factually accurate in its broad strokes, and mainstream Egyptology does not dispute that later pyramids generally show a decline in construction quality compared to the 4th dynasty peak represented by Khufu's, Khafra's, and to a lesser extent Menkaur's pyramids at Giza. Where mainstream archaeology disagrees sharply is on the explanation. The conventional view holds that the 4th dynasty represented a rare and temporary convergence of factors, a highly centralized and stable state, enormous mobilized labor and resources, a royal ideology that made pyramid building an all-consuming national priority, and crucially, direct continuity of expertise, since Khufu's architects were the direct professional descendants of the builders of the earlier 3rd dynasty step pyramids under Djoser, refining a tradition that was already several generations deep by the time the Great Pyramid was built. The decline afterward, this view holds, reflects economic strain, political fragmentation, and a gradual scaling back of royal ambition, not a lost civilization's fading memory. Egypt's old kingdom eventually collapsed into a period of internal division known as the First Intermediate Period, and pyramid building on the Giza scale was never fully attempted again, not because the knowledge vanished, but because no later state had the same combination of centralized power and resources to attempt it. It is worth being honest that this mainstream explanation, while coherent, does not answer every question with total confidence. Egyptologists still debate exactly how the largest blocks were moved and raised, how ramps were configured at the upper courses of the pyramid, and how such extraordinary alignment to true north, accurate to within a fraction of a degree, was achieved using the astronomical and surveying tools available at the time. These are open technical questions within mainstream archaeology itself, actively studied through ongoing excavation, papyri discoveries like the Diary of Merer found at Wadi al-Jarf in 2013, which directly describes limestone transport logistics for the Great Pyramid, and continued materials analysis. Uncertainty about specific construction logistics is not the same thing as evidence for a lost global civilization, but it is also not nothing. And it is part of why this topic continues to generate genuine scholarly debate rather than settled consensus extends well beyond Egypt. He connects the granite question to a wider argument about an advanced civilization existing at the end of the last ice age, destroyed by catastrophic flooding as glaciers melted roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, a period that does correspond to a real and well-documented climate event called the Younger Dryas, when global temperatures dropped sharply for about 1,200 years before rebounding, and sea levels did rise substantially as ice sheets melted, submerging coastal areas worldwide. This much is solid, mainstream climate science. What is not established by mainstream archaeology is Hancock's next step, that an advanced, technologically sophisticated human civilization existed during this period was destroyed by the associated flooding and passed fragments of its knowledge to survivors who later became the Egyptians, and separately the builders of sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. No archaeological site, artifact, or written record from this period has been found that demonstrates the kind of advanced tool-making, metallurgy, or engineering capability Hancock's theory requires. The archaeological record for the end of the last ice age shows sophisticated hunter-gatherer societies capable of remarkable achievements, Göbekli Tepe itself being a genuine and still not fully explained marvel of monumental construction by people without agriculture or metal tools, but nothing resembling the precision stoneworking technology needed to explain granite drilling 4,000 years later in Egypt. There's one more piece of physical evidence worth examining closely, because it is the strongest case. The granite boxes housed in the underground galleries at Saqqara, part of a structure known as the Serapeum, built to hold the mummified remains of sacred Apis bulls. These boxes are enormous, some weighing more than 60 tons apiece, carved from single blocks of granite and hollowed out with walls of remarkably consistent thickness. Dunn measured the interior. Surfaces of several of these boxes, using precision straight edges and feeler gauges, the same instruments used in aerospace machining, and reported that the walls were flat to within a few thousandths of an inch, with corners cut close to a true 90 degrees and opposite faces closely parallel. He He has argued publicly that this level of flatness, achieved on the inside of a sealed, hollowed cavity where a craftsman could not easily see or reach to check their work by eye, is difficult to explain through hand grinding alone, since hand tools tend to introduce small, uneven variations that accumulate over a large surface. Mainstream Egyptologists who have responded to Dunn's measurements do not generally dispute aesthetic raw numbers themselves, but they do dispute the conclusion drawn from them. Skilled stoneworkers checking their own progress with straight edges, plumb lines, and water levels, all of which are attested in Egyptian art and archaeological finds, can achieve very high degrees of flatness over time through repeated measurement and correction, essentially manually iterating toward precision, the same way a machine achieves it automatically. This is slower and more labor intensive than mechanized production, but it is not physically impossible, and craftsmen operating within a tightly controlled state workshop system, answerable for the quality of royal or sacred commissions, would have had every incentive to check and correct their work repeatedly rather than accept the first pass. It is also worth noting that the Serapeum boxes date from a much later period than the Great Pyramid, roughly the New Kingdom through Late Period, meaning they represent the product of a stoneworking tradition with well over 1,000 years of additional accumulated practice behind it by the time they were carved, which complicates any argument that treats all high-precision Egyptian granite work as belonging to one single unexplained skill spike at the very beginning of Egyptian history. This is really the crux of where the two positions diverge, and it is worth stating plainly rather than dancing around it. The tool marks in Egyptian granite are real, and they are genuinely impressive. Nobody serious disputes that. Where the disagreement lies is in interpretation. Hancock and sympathetic engineers like Dunn look at the precision and conclude that ordinary Bronze Age tools, worked by ordinary human hands, cannot fully explain it, and infer that something else must be responsible. Mainstream Egyptology and experimental archaeologists like Stocks look at the same precision, replicate substantial portions of it using copper, sand, and patient labor, and conclude that the remaining gap is explained by scale of effort, generational specialization, and the loss of certain fine-tuned techniques and quality control practices over time, rather than by a lost civilization or an unidentified advanced technology. It is also worth noting a pattern in how Hancock frames uncertainty, because it matters for how you weigh his conclusions. He is careful, more careful than many alternative history commentators, to phrase his central claims as questions and possibilities rather than proven facts. He does not claim to know exactly what tool cut the granite, or exactly what the lost civilization looked like, or exactly how its knowledge reached Egypt. This rhetorical carefulness is genuine and distinguishes his work from outright pseudo-archaeology that fabricates evidence outright. But it also makes the theory difficult to test or falsify in the way a scientific hypothesis normally would be, since almost any gap in the archaeological record can be folded into evidence of a lost civilization we have not yet found, rather than treated as an open question awaiting a mundane answer, which is how professional archaeology generally treats such gaps. So where does that leave the actual question in the title? How did the ancient Egyptians really cut granite? The honest answer, built from the physical evidence that both sides actually agree exists, looks like this. They used copper tools, not because copper is hard, but because copper is soft enough to hold an abrasive without shattering, and durable enough to be reshaped and reused as it wore down. They used quartz sand, sourced locally and cheaply as the true cutting agent. Embe, diyed into the copper surface and dragged across the granite under pressure, using tube drills for hollowing and boring, straight saws for slicing large blocks, and handheld pounders made of an even harder stone called dolerite for the roughest initial shaping, since dolerite itself sits close to granite on the hardness scale and could be used to bash and crush granite's surface into shape before finer abrasive work refined it. This entire toolkit is directly attested in the archaeological record. Dolerite pounding balls have been found by the thousands at ancient granite quarries near Aswan, some still sitting exactly where workers left them, alongside unfinished obelisks abandoned mid-extraction, giving archaeologists a rare direct window into the actual quarrying process rather than having to reconstruct it purely from finished objects. The most famous of these unfinished pieces, the unfinished obelisk still lying in its quarry bed at Aswan, would have stood over 41 meters tall and weighed an estimated 1,090 tons had it been completed, making it larger than any obelisk ever successfully raised in Egypt. It was abandoned after cracks developed in the granite during the pounding and grinding process, and it remains partially attached to the bedrock today. This single object, sitting in plain view and open to tourists, is in many ways more informative than any theory about lost civilizations, because it captures Egyptian granite work not as a finished, mysterious result, but as an active, imperfect CT, labor-intensive process that sometimes failed. You can see the channels ground out around its edges, channels wide enough for workers to kneel in and swing dolerite pounders downward in a rhythm, channel after channel for the months it would have taken to free a piece of stone this size from the bedrock if the crack had not ended the project first. None of this fully closes every gap Hancock and Dunn have raised. The precise speed and force behind Petrie's original drill core measurements remain genuinely debated in specialist circles, and reasonable, technically informed people continue to disagree about whether Stocks's experimental results fully scale up to explain every example of fine Egyptian granite work, particularly the most extreme cases of flatness and symmetry, documented by Dunn. What can be said with confidence is that the core premise many alternative history videos present as settled fact, that copper and sand simply cannot cut granite at all, and that Egyptologists have no real answer, is not accurate. Egyptologists do have an answer. It has been tested experimentally and repeatedly since the 1990s, and it works, even if some edge cases remain more contested than the mainstream consensus is always eager to admit. What remains genuinely open is not whether ancient Egyptians could cut granite. They demonstrably could, and left behind the unfinished quarry sites, the worn-out pounding stones, and the discarded drill cores to prove exactly how. What remains open is the deeper, more human question underneath Hancock's theory: why does so much of ancient Egypt's finest work cluster so early and decline so sharply afterward? That decline is real. Its cause, a temporary alignment of political power, resources, and generational expertise that Egypt achieved once and never fully recreated, or something older and stranger that Egyptology has not yet found a way to prove, remains the one part of this story that is not settled, and probably will not be for a long time. The granite does not lie. It shows scrape marks, saw lines, drill grooves, and the patient signature of thousands of hours of human effort. What it cannot tell us, on its own, is everything about the minds and the world that produced it. That gap between what the stone can prove and what it can only suggest is exactly where this argument has lived for over a century, and exactly why it is not going away anytime soon.